everyone, and welcome to today's live stream and chat about a project that I recently got done, and it was like the project that never ended. I decided to take it upon myself to build a giant wrap-around storage unit. So I started to build a couple units, and then, well, I end up with this kind of corner space that I don't know what to do with. I had this giant unit on the left here and this smaller cabinet to hold brooms and to hold lawn equipment on the right there. And I built the one on the left first and then the one on the right. And then I was like, okay, now I'm left with this weird corner. There's like electrical outlets here, a vent, a drain pipe, and another electrical outlet. So you can always build a corner cabinet. We've all seen those China cabinets that have collectibles and you put it in the corner. Like, personally, I don't like those things. They're triangular shape and it's really tough to store oversized items in it. Stuff is always like poking out. And plus I'd have to cut out holes for all the outlets and the vents. And I decided, nah, I'm not gonna go that way. So I decided to do like corner floating shelves. So the first thing we have to do is measure. This is not something I really like to do, which is kind of how I got into this floating corner cabinet situation. Oh, you can see that enthusiasm on my face. Look at this joy of measuring that is going on right about here. So, oh, you are off the camera there. This is how good this is going. This project is getting off. Oh, yep, there I noticed. No, you measured there. All right, so let's get a measurement up and down the cabinets, because one thing you'll quickly notice is that corners aren't really straight. So sometimes on the top of the cabinet, you might get a slightly different measurement than the bottom of the cabinet. I've already scored where I want my shelves to go. I got about like a 16-inch vertical space so I can fit some oversized items. The next one is to actually start assembling some kind of frame for this. Because in this special instance, I am connecting this to two existing structures, you do have to take your time and measure and test fit in between every cut, in between every little piece that you put together, because it's going to be slightly different every shelf. Unlike building corner shelves floating corner shelves where it's a standalone, then you can just pretty much cookie cutter the design once you have it. So I made sure everything fits and slipped in, because again, we have to pivot the actual shelf to get it in there. That is the slowest screwing in that I've ever seen people. Oh, geez, this is embarrassing. Like, this is the kind of stuff that like most YouTubers will just cut out, so you look like a champ, putting in those screws. But no, not me. I am showing you guys everything. Sticking a sample little block in there to make sure I have enough clearance. And you might have noticed some blue tape on the wall, and that's just for where the studs are, because later as this comes together, the last thing you want to do is put like a structural thing where you also have to drill in a stud. We're gonna fast forward the rest of this frame building business here. I'm continuing to cut the pieces of wood because you can start seeing the frame coming together here, and still the screwing has not gotten any faster. Look at that. Sometimes building on the floor, you think, well, the floor is pretty straight. You can level everything out a little bit, but you do lose a lot of leverage that way. So you can see the main frame complete here, one side longer than the other. So this is kind of like the outer frame. And these particular screws, you don't need to use a pilot hole, but I just find it so much easier just to do that. It just goes in. Look at this. This is just embarrassing. Now this needs to stop. We need like, some muscle in there. So here I'm putting in a center brace. That way when I lay the 1/4-inch plywood on top, it's got something to rest on, so it doesn't have to go such a long stretch with no support. Now this is where marking your studs on your main frame there is super important, because you already see that this a particular support beam is slightly shifted over, and that's because it needs to avoid the stud. I've made that mistake before where you're about to put it in and you're like, oh, I can't access the studs. You see me having to flip the frame around, and this is one of the reasons why I kind of cut some of those edges just slightly short so I have more pivot angle. And here I am putting the frame into the stud, and all it takes is one good screw and you have it aligned with your line, and then you can sit there and shimmy it up and down and pivot it until it's perfect. And then just finish putting them in. And here, using shorter screws, I'm attaching them to the side walls of each unit. I decided to anchor them to the side. That way I have a little more oomph for these 18-inch, depth. This is kind of like how it looks like when it's done. You have all four, they're evenly spaced out, which, is quite a feat for minimal measuring. I thought everything looked pretty good, and I avoided all the electrical sockets, all the things that I needed to avoid. For each one, I actually had to measure individually because they're slightly different, just to accommodate like the crookedness of the walls and crookedness of the cabinets a little bit. And here I'm taking a 1x6 and cutting it down to a legit 1x4. This is a true 1x4. That way I get a flush finish. Here, I'm just putting in a shim because I did cut everything slightly shorter just to be able to pivot this entire shelf into place. So you can use shims to kind of square everything up, clamp it down. And here I go again with the longer piece. Now, I do admit having to flip it over and cut one side and then flip it over and cut the other side, probably should have used a table saw. But here in a small shop, it's an ordeal to have to switch tools all the time. The one has to go away, then you got to drag out the other. I don't have them all out. So I kind of shortcutted and used the miter saw for everything. You can see a couple jagged edges there that, listen, it's nothing that can't be fixed with a sander. I don't know, I think it's looking pretty nice. And you can see these pieces right here are extra thick because I decided to make the very top shelf and the very bottom shelf the true 1x6, like nice chunky ones. And the two in the middle, 4 inches in width. So you can see that they're a little bit thinner. And I just used some brad nails. You can use a little glue and brad nails to kind of help hold everything into place. Am I going to stain this whole thing? Or maybe I could do some top and bottom panels that are different colors. I just couldn't decide. I had already done so much staining. You saw a ton of staining going on one cabinet and the other, and I was just like plain bored of staining. So at this crossroads, if you want to stain your entire shelf, go ahead and cut your top and bottom covering plywood panels and attach them and stain the whole thing at once. So I decided to stain the face frames first. It, bought me a little more time to decide what I actually want to do with the rest of this project. And I figured worst case scenario, if I also decided to stain the top and bottom pieces, well, that's no big deal. Just like an extra step. And here was the first time that I used an actual sponge to do this. Normally I use a rag to apply and remove the excess stain. This is like a 97 little cent foam. And if you go into the forums, you're going to get all kinds of opinions on the foam is better, the rag is better, the brush, buy a fine brush. For my simple projects, I'm not doing this for high-end clientele, just myself. I found that using the foam brush and the regular rag kind of gave me the same results, but you might save a little bit more stain using the rag. I found that too. So all the face frames are stained up, and now comes the moment of truth. What do I want to do for these tops and bottoms? I think I want to paint these, and I thought about doing a really cool steampunk industrial, like maybe making this look like metal. But before we do that, we actually have to cut out these panels. And for this, instead of busting out the table saw or the miter, I just decided to do what I do best, which is eyeball it. And I've gotten pretty good with cutting with a jigsaw and making mostly straight lines, but you can see all the panels kind of piling up. You just have to measure and cut, measure and cut. So that theme, if you're connecting your corner shelves to 2 other units, it's kind of the theme of the entire project, because you just have to angle things a little bit differently depending on if your wall kind of, gets a little crooked. Now was my strategy for painting them, and I figured, okay, I've got this metal effect down. This is what I'm gonna do. I try and do minimal painting outside. We have huge, like Wizard of Oz, winds, and you can see how close I have to get to the panel just to get paint on it. Most of it actually just washes away and just drifts. My strategy here, I thought, was to get a coat of black and then a coat of silver, and I figured, you know what? Things are gonna start to look pretty metallic. And yes, there is some sexy silver spraying going on right about now, but even so, you can see how close I have to get to the piece just to get even coverage. And I ended up burning through a lot of silver paint. It looked pretty bad. And by the time I looked at all these silver panels, like honestly, it looked like wood panels painted silver. It just looks like a child's craft project. And I decided, time to sand everything, and I think I'm just gonna stain it all because that was a big mistake. Let's start sanding the whole thing off. And there I go, let's just sand. Well, one of the things is, lo and behold, as I started sanding this, it started to look really good. And on the panels that I did use the hammered, you got these spots because the hammered paint actually gums up in the sandpaper and create these age spots on your panel, and it looks very real. And I started to really like this. I'm like, okay, this is looking good. Maybe we don't have to bag it. And then I followed up with some hand sanding, creating some realistic scratches, and some of the black showed through just to give it that depth that you would see with real metal. And the wood grain just looked like it was aging in all kinds of cross hatches. It looked pretty aged to me, but I really wanted these to start looking like they were rusting. And starting with the black, I always like to use the darker color first. And just starting with the edges, if you think of a panel that's been sitting out in a field or in a barn, the edges start to kind of like get cruddy. And if they're outside, then especially they look a little muddy. And I went a little heavier on the corners just to make it look more realistic. And I found that by using my fingers to smudge the paint, well, that took some of the brush stroke out, so it didn't look too like Bob Ross artsy, although he's my man. Love his shows. And of course, you always get little shop helpers giving their opinions and always saying, yep, that doesn't look good, move the brush, you got to put a couple more spots over here, you're going way too crazy with this one spot. And then creating a couple pitting effects, and all it is loading your brush up with paint, brushing the majority of it off on your palette or on your piece of paper there, and just using it very dry. And here I'm following up with brown. And when you put the brown on top of the black, especially dry brush, the colors begin to blend in a very realistic way. And the brown is a very good method of just dirtying up your piece. And you can see some of the panels there with those age spots I was telling you about with the gummy bear hammered paint effect after you sand it. And so not just doing the edges, but adding a couple interesting features in the middle too, I thought would make it look more realistic. But I didn't want to go overboard because the more rusty you make it look, it starts to turn brown. And I already got enough brown going on with these two units. And of course, this is the icing on the cake, is that red oxide. And I use this really sparingly to make it look realistic. I didn't want the project to turn too orangey or too brown. And just a little bit went a long way. And this panel is already looking 10 times better than what I had, which was that kitty craft, little silver wood panel looking things. I mean, that couldn't have gone on. And if this didn't work, then yeah, this would have been a much different stream where we would just see a lot of staining over and over again. So yeah, I hit up the areas where I wanted it to look like it had been aging a lot longer. And the nice thing with dry brushing is the paint dries almost immediately. So you hit it up with your fingers and it's pretty much ready to install as soon as you're done painting. You don't have to wait for it to dry or anything like that. So here you can see the combinations of silvers, blacks, red oxides, the browns, and it all kind of combined to create this cool aged look. So I think it all worked out, and in the end, the wood grain actually helped. It actually made it look more scratchy and more irregular. I think this could have just gone on to the frames and we would have been done, right? But no, in typical Rachel fashion, how can we complicate this project even more? Oh yeah, so I decided, okay, old metal needs rivets, right? So I bought this box here of like 600 thumbtacks, and I decided, you know what, this is gonna be an easy project. I'm just gonna like hammer them in. But one thing I quickly found out was, that's a little long. I'm gonna have to trim these. They look awfully shiny. I did all this work to get those panels to look old, rusted, rustic, steampunk looking, and I'm about to put some shiny thumbtacks on them using 100 grit sandpaper to just knock off the shine from their heads. This multiplied by what ended up being almost 600, because you can see there is still some left over in my box here, but this was probably the longest part of this entire project, was just sanding all those little thumbtack noggins and cutting their little stems so that way they would fit the 1/4 inch plywood. Luckily that didn't take very long, and they trim very easily with just a pair of cutters. I I had some qualms about just hammering these into the wood without giving them some pilot holes there. You know, not maybe the most best constructed. So I decided to space them out at 2 inches each. Now, in a previous live stream, this was somebody's suggestion. I had them out at about 1 inch each. It looked like, you know how upholstery is when they use those little buttons? That's what it reminded me of. It didn't look like real steel panels. And in retrospect, looking at this again, I think this looks pretty good. But spacing them out even further, I think I would have gotten better results. Plus, way less thumbtacks to have to sand and trim and all that. So either it'll look better or secretly, I just want to do less work. I'm going to let you guys figure that one out. So many panels and much hammering at night. And I'm finally getting to the point where I can actually wrap up this project, install them, and see if this thing even looks good together. Oh, there's my little helper again. He loves to give his opinion. And oh, he doesn't like where my lighting is. He's moving it. Oh, he's okay. We got everything painted. Let's get it installed. Finally, people. All right, so here's me installing. And one of the things you'll find is after painting it, sometimes you do have to take a sander and just shave some of those edges down so everything fits nice and flush. But overall, worst case scenario, a little spanking here and there on those panels gets them down, and a couple brad nails to hold them in place. Now for the top ones, I don't really use glue. I like to leave myself an access point. Say sometime in the future I want to remove these. Well, I can stick like a screwdriver in there or a pry bar and pry them up and have access to those screws holding this unit into the stud. Now for the bottom ones, those you can either use glue or not. I did use just a little bit of glue. In the garage, you have a lot of temperature changes. Wood is gonna expand and contract. I figured it's just kind of an extra way to have the panel stay up and not fall on my head or fall on my items. So I thought it was really cool having the same effect on the top and on the bottom. A lot of times when you're mid-project, you're like, I could just cut out and bail now, you know, and get this thing done and stain the bottom panels, but only do the metal effect on top. I mean, there's a lot of ways to slice a project. This is what it ended up looking like. I thought that the mix of wood and metal looked pretty realistic. It reminded me of one of those like old Edison style warehouses. I don't know, maybe throw a couple fancy Edison bulbs in the area just to make it look really steampunk, 1920s era style. And I thought that by painting the panels individually, I gave them different directions in terms of the rust, made it look unique and not so cookie cutter panels. I made each one slightly different. Post up what you think. And guys, this project is done. Another one. I would love to hear. Please don't tell me I'm the only one. Tell me about a project. Post in the comments even after this stream is done. Even you guys watching on replay of a project you started, had insta regrets, but then stuck by and you know what? Actually ended up liking the final result. So I definitely want to hear, that way I can say, see, he did it, she did it, you know, we're all in the same boat. We do have these projects that kind of like get away from us sometimes. So thanks again for joining, and a special thanks to our Wrench Army members, because it's through your direct support that I'm able to do these projects, record them all, stream them with all this equipment. And for those of you that just came out, hung out to watch, commented, thank you too, because through your help, it makes it a lot easier for other people to discover what I'm doing. Maybe they want to hop on board and learn something new. It's not always going to be the most correct way to do stuff, but heck, it's worked for me, and then you get better over time. So thanks a lot for joining. And if you're interested in the Wrench Army, if you're on YouTube, hit the join button. Those of you that love Patreon, head on over there. Or you can also join through the website. The experience is the same. My name is Rachel Barros, and you've been watching Gearhead Diva.